I mean, I'm very bullish on the frontier labs. Mostly because of that first reason you mentioned, which is that it is very positive. So on the market's like huge. There's, I don't even think we're like remotely close to that spot where it starts to become more zero sum.
Awesome. We're back with the next episode of First Pass. We have Jesse, co-founder and CEO of Decagon with us today. Jesse, thanks for joining.
Yeah, good to see you both. Thanks for having me.
You wrote an awesome blog post. It was titled Everyone Was Wrong About Open Source AI in the Enterprise. I really enjoyed reading it. I know a lot of other people really enjoyed reading it. So we wanted to talk with you about it today. One of the stats you mentioned is that 90% of Decagon's production workloads run on open weight models, but cost wasn't the primary reason. If it wasn't cost, what was it?
It's latency. So usually with models, there's three dimensions that you care about. It's intelligence, cost, and latency. Most growth stage companies, you're not really optimizing for cost at the time. And so the reason why we kind of had to do all this work, and it was like, I would say fairly effortful, was because of latency. And the idea is that smaller models have faster latency than larger models, and we care about latency. And so in our voice agents, in our AI agents, having lower latency is really important.
Yeah, awesome. And so walk us through the life cycle of a model inside of Decagon. I think you laid out this journey of we're going to start with an experiment with frontier models and tokens. Use case is going to mature. We're going to think about then kind of what the right model is for the use case. Like, in your own words, walk us through the evolution of a model inside of Decagon.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with a use case, right? So, we're not using models just to use the models. And so, for our use case, our first very simple use case was, hey, can we get an AI agent to answer customer service inquiries or kind of have conversations with the customer well? And before we knew the answer to that, obviously you want to use the frontier models because, they're the smartest models and you just want to get it to the point where the conversations feel natural and you are solving their problem and you're taking actions at the right time. And there's sometimes like very complicated procedures you have to adhere to. And so that's generally step one. Step one is like, hey, let's get the smartest models out there. Those are generally the big models. And then you kind of get something working. From there, as you scale up, you realize like, oh, wow, we're handling a ton of volume. Latency matters and sort of the performance matters. And so you break down your agent into different model calls and you realize, oh, well, for this model call, we don't need a model that big because all this model is doing is it's determining the topic that the person is talking about, right? So that's just an example, but okay, if that's what the model is doing, then you don't need all those other parameters in that big model that are doing other things and no other things. And so that's the motivation for why you can take a big model and make it a small model. Unfortunately, most of the small models out of the box are not smart enough to do that one task as well as a big model. And so you have to go through that progression of like, okay, let's get the small model, let's tune it and teach it how to do that just one job. And then you benchmark it. And by the end of that process, it should be doing that job better than the big model because it's tuned for that one job. And then you kind of rinse and repeat that process over all the jobs in the agent. And eventually that's why we're now at 90+%. There are still several tasks where you would still benefit from frontier models. But by and large, we have at least moved to these smaller models.
Following up on that, what are some of the biggest challenges in migrating from closed models to open models?
Yeah, I mean, the reason to use open models is that you can tune them a lot better, right? Because you have full control over the weights. There are a lot of like different techniques you can use. And that process is not easy because one, you have to have like the know-how and like the sort of infrastructure set up to actually tune these models. And then step two, you need the data. And the data is tricky because it's like the data is very specialized, right? It's very specialized to not just your use case, but also like the way you've chosen to design our use case, design our agent. The way we've designed our agent could be different from how other people have designed their other, even like customer service agents. So it's very specific to us and we have to get that data somehow. Usually customer data is not really the type of data that you need. You kind of need targeted data for like, again, that one use case, right? So if it's topic selection, you need like a nice varied set of topic selection examples. And so there's that data collection process. And then there's the actual evaluation and benchmarking, which also is specific to you, because general benchmarks are not really like it could be really good at coding or whatever, right? Like that's like irrelevant to us. And so we also have to create our own benchmarks. So it's kind of that process, which is why like kind of one of the theses in my post is that even though this process makes a lot of sense, it only really makes sense for large sort of scaled use cases where you're already in production, you already know the shape of your agent, and the use case is mature. If you're just still discovering if the use case is going to be useful or not, or if it's going to be a scaled process, like all these steps might not be worth it because it is pretty effortful.
Yeah. On that point, in your blog, you mentioned that open source model share of, and I guess enterprise spend went down from 19% to 11%, despite, open source models getting better, all these other benefits that you just talked about. Why is that? If open source model usage is increasing, why is their sort of market share going down?
Yeah, I mean, the usage of everything is increasing, right? And I think right now what we're seeing is that the number of use cases that people are spinning up is very high. Like there's like all sorts of new ideas for how we can use AI in the company. And so they're spinning up all these new projects, and some of them will work, some of them won't work, and that's totally fine. But for all those experiments, you're using frontier models. And so like one way of describing it is that you want to use the frontier models for that experimentation and that sort of, testing process. And once it's mature and you're kind of ready for production and scale, then you kind of decide, is it worth it to use open source models? But right now, I think the state of AI in the enterprise is that there's so many cool use cases, so many like interesting use cases that people are spinning up that it just makes sense to use frontier models for it. So both frontier and open source are just growing really fast. It seems like frontier is growing faster currently. And I'd imagine we will see at some point, it's hard to say when that point is, but I think at least many years, you'll start to see like that shift, because you don't have to use frontier models for more mature use cases.
I love the positive sum framing, and I feel like that's a phrase I've been using very often over the last few weeks and months, which is, I think a lot of people want to reduce down this conversation to there's a fixed amount of tokens being generated or models being called, and hey, guess what, the mix shift is going to shift from frontier closed tokens to open weight tokens, and that's all going to come at the expense of each other. And it just feels we're so early in this phase shift that the top of the funnel is growing so quickly. And as you mentioned, a lot of that top of funnel is being captured by frontier tokens. Hey, and then eventually you're going to figure out what model is right for your use case. And a lot of those might be smaller models or cheaper models. But you want to you want to experiment with the best so you know what's possible. Maybe a last question for you here. Two questions. How long do you think that period persist of, hey, we're in this kind of like constant experimentation, the top of the funnel is kind of growing exponentially? Because I think that's an interesting almost sub question of what I'm then going to ask you after.
I think it depends on the use case. I would say for us, maybe in the first 9 to 12 months is when we first started deciding, hey, this is already going to scale pretty quickly. We do care about latency, especially in these voice agents. So, we got to make that switch. And once it's done, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? Because it's faster latency, it's equal or better performance, and you got to get these benefits of costs, which is a nice side effect. So it makes a lot of sense to do it, but for the use case, you have to be really committed to like, okay, here's the shape of the agent. We're not really changing this, because you can't undo fine tuning. It's like you can't be like, oh well, actually, there's this portion of the data set that we actually don't want to do anymore. It's like, okay, well now you're starting from scratch. So, I think 9 to 12 months was generally how long it took us, but I think for other use cases it could take longer.
I think you're also quite on the bleeding edge, both in terms of like how you think about your infrastructure and the talent you have as employees. But maybe as a little bit of a hot topic or fun question. What do you think this means then for the future of some of the labs? So let's say at some point in time, we hit more market maturity, wherever that might be. And like I personally believe market maturity won't be for quite some time. But once we get there and the top of funnel as I've described it earlier, maybe stops growing exponentially, then maybe the world starts to look a little bit more zero sum, and open weight models may in fact start to take meaningful share away from frontier labs and tokens. Like, what do you think that means for the frontier labs? Do they need to evolve? Like, do you think they need to offer open weight models and smaller models? And the kind of the GPT latest series of models that has kind of have done that. Broken out into sub smaller models as well as like the large ones. But what do you think this means for some of the frontier labs?
I mean, I'm very bullish on the frontier labs. Mostly because of that first reason you mentioned, which is that it is very positive. So on the market's like huge. There's, I don't even think we're like remotely close to that spot where it starts to become more zero sum. But if we get there, I think the main question would be like, who is the actual frontier, right? Like right now, the reason why there's even more conversations about open source is that like, oh, are like the Kimmys of the world actually getting to that level and like eventually going to surpass OpenAI and Anthropic? I personally think that's unlikely, but that's just like my opinion. I'm not super close to kind of either influencing or like caring massively about that outcome. But I do think that's probably the big question of where like who's going to be on the frontier. There's also a chance that the frontier models that are like the frontier adjacent models that are open source will be less and less open source over time because they need to like collect more cash for their economics or whatever, right? So like you could see like a lot of the Chinese labs making it like kind of getting market share now and then, okay, at some point we're gonna still open source it, but then leave the like super frontier stuff closed source. That's hard to say, but I think it will. I think the frontier stuff will. I think that's like more like the question of like who owns the frontier model. I think my point was that in most use cases in the future, you're not going to need frontier models. So you can use like smaller models or like, because again, you don't need it to know all that other stuff. You just need it to be good at your one task. And so those I would say are going to move more and more towards open source because people are going to want to customize those models.
Awesome. Well, Jesse, thanks so much for joining us today. I enjoyed the conversation. I think what you're building is awesome. And hearing what people are actually doing and how they're building on the bleeding edge is always insightful. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.